Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show, we have Scott LaFoy. Scott is a military analyst, and his work, focusing on North Korea, ranges from nuclear weapons to ballistic missiles to missile defense, and of course the topic of today's discussion, cyber warfare. Now, just as with all things North Korea, this is an incredibly hard issue to look into. North Korea doesn't publish information, and of course, no government really publishes this sort of open information on cyber warfare. It's by its nature clandestine. So what we get here from Scott is a fascinating strategic look inside this shadowy, emergent area of North Korean warfare. Throughout its history, North Korea has looked for asymmetric threats that are not easily replicable from those that they would use them against. And of course, with much of North Korea's eyes gazing downward on the southern half of the peninsula, and highly equipped American-backed South Korean troops, the regime in Pyongyang has realized that it needs something else. It's not going to simply be able to outweigh these forces by numbers alone. The technology is just not on their side. So any war with the South, even Japan, even America for that matter, will have to be conducted at speed. And this is where cyber operations comes into the makeup. When it comes to conventional war, this new weapon opens avenues that didn't exist before to disrupt, exhaust, coerce, harass the enemy. And there's no doubt that much of North Korea's build-up in the area has had to do with just this. Following this, some of Scott's unique work has looked into the Reconnaissance General Bureau, the main office behind a lot of these cyber attacks. We look into the leadership, the structure, the makeup, and the military purpose for this organization. And an awful lot of this in this podcast is scene setting, trying to show you, the listener, just how these new cyber operations fit inside existing military structures. And with this in hand, the latter part of our discussion moves into a series of fascinating case studies, a series of cyber attacks that North Korea have actually undertaken around the world. We look into the different motivations behind them, the different outcomes, their success or failure, the evolution of such attacks, and how these are likely to continue into the future. We talk through the Sony episode, the Dark Soul attacks, the attack on Britain's National Health Service, a significant international bank heist from Bangladesh, and an incredibly difficult to read but fascinating attack on Orascom in 2017. This is all a very slow build towards a broad picture of North Korea's cyber operations. And it is in some way built upon a publication that Scott co-wrote in 2015, the link to which is provided below. What Scott LaFoy has given us here is a rare and heavily researched insight into an incredibly hard to glean aspect of North Korea's military capabilities. And if you want to follow more of Scott's work, you can find it at the Arms Control Wonk, the link to which is provided below. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon link attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So on that, and without any further delay, this is Scott LaFoy. Scott LaFoy, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be speaking about North Korea's cyber capabilities. Now this is a difficult topic to speak about. It's quite opaque, it's quite challenging. So just as a first kind of flag post here, I might get you to go back and give the listener just a broader picture of what North Korea's broader kind of military capabilities are, and then we'll fit into that where the cyber capabilities fit.
Absolutely. So North Korea's military is very old. I know this is sort of a trope from the 2000s and 1990s, but North Korea's general conventional forces are somewhat behind the times. There are older systems that don't have sort of cutting edge new tech in them. So you'll see tanks that will be very familiar to anyone who watched the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 1970s. Large amounts of artillery, of course, ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, but everything basically designed to create an intractable route of advance so that it would be nearly impossible for a state to move through North Korea without incredible loss. But then they have this sort of other set of weapons besides these old, heavy weapons. They have these asymmetric capabilities that allow them to sort of reach out and strategically affect their opponents without actually engaging in conflict. So it allows them to sort of continue to militarily engage, not fall totally behind strategically, but without ever actually coming into serious conflict. And these would be things like the ballistic missiles, which allow them to force Japan and South Korea and Russia and China and the United States to the bargaining table or to do certain actions. And what we're talking about today, their operational cyber capabilities, which are primarily designed so that they can exfiltrate data, take a look at their adversaries, politically coerce their opponents, engage in bizarre economic bargaining in one case, and steal money for the regime.
Okay, well, that's quite a broad picture there. That's great. So what I might do now is, I've seen that you've mentioned it a couple of times, so I'm going to touch on this because people often look at North Korea and they miss, despite North Korea saying it themselves, exactly what North Korea's military buildup is all about, why they have forces and what their primary goal is. And you said it, I've seen you say it once or twice before, and just speak a little bit briefly about this idea of reunification. And this is why North Korea are building this up. It's not so much a defensive mechanism, but this is a long-term goal of the regime to reunify the peninsula.
Right. So in strategic literature, for analysts who try to sort of divine the regime's goals, obviously we haven't exactly interviewed Kim Jong-un to get his opinion on it, but there's a large body of literature that believes that the entire point of the military is to reunify the entire Korean peninsula under the North Korean regime, and that sort of all of their military forces fall into some place in that. There is academic disagreement about this, about whether or not the regime actually is looking to reunite the peninsula, or whether or not that's sort of a propaganda line because it's become such a difficult prospect. I mean, reunifying the peninsula under South Korean leadership would be incredibly difficult. So some people say, that the North just would be so incapable of leading this that that may be a withered goal. But if that is the case, sort of the military aspect of it starts to become fairly clear. It's got this large bulwark to prevent anyone pushing north. You have nuclear weapons to essentially prevent larger states from interacting in the peninsula or kicking them out in the form of early precision nuclear strikes that would sort of prevent an adversary such as the United States from being able to bring large shipments of materiel in. And there's this idea of a lightning war that's very popular in literature. I believe it's Ken Goss and Andrews Scoble talk about this a lot. The idea that North Korea knows it can't fight a protracted war. Like, you can't have a World War II or a Vietnam War on the Korean Peninsula again. You would have to have something that is resolved before the U.S. can sort of spin up its full military might, because once that happens, the game's over, because the U.S. can fight for longer than North Korea. It's larger. It has an economy that can sustain a wartime footing for a long period of time. It can produce more material than the North Koreans. And so one of the ideas is essentially that the entire North Korean military, even though it's this fairly slow, heavy metal type of military. It's very mechanized, lots of tanks, lots of tracked vehicles. It's not exactly, a light fleet of foot fighting force, but that still its goal would be essentially early knockout punches with asymmetric weapons, such as military-grade cyber weapons where you're looking to take down communication networks, confuse South Korean and American units by destroying essentially their ability to access good information. And then, of course, using ballistic missiles to physically start removing certain aspects of the adversarial military, and then bringing that sort of wave of heavy armor downwards in the peninsula, and in particular removing Pusan, which is a major strategic asset, especially since during the Korean War, Pusan was essentially the vector through which the United States sort of kept the Korean peninsula from full northern domination. That's at least sort of the thought process behind, if they are trying to reunite the peninsula, that's sort of how a war would be prosecuted.
And you touched on it before there, about this idea of an asymmetric warfare, this idea that North Korea need to build up something on their side that is not easily matched by the other side. And as we move forward here, and just as we slow walk up onto the place that cyber warfare has taken inside the North Korean military setup, there is an awful long history of this, and I suppose this is important to come across, a long history of, I suppose they are asymmetric incursions of small-scale military engagements from north to south, and deliberately trying to disrupt and cause havoc in the south. Things like the 1968 Blue House attack and a couple of presidential assassination attempts, and of course the downing of the airplane in 1987.
Oh, yes. And that's something that I feel like most folks who work sort of with North Korean diplomatic history or history of relationship with the United States would be very familiar with sort of this pattern of some sort of escalated incursion leads to some sort of engagement that changes, the status quo in some way. And North Korea is fairly good at that tactic. But even from a non-diplomatic standpoint, as you said, there's just these military incursions and this long history of asymmetric military. I feel like asymmetric military engagement was what I was going to say. That sounds very nice. These are violent attacks.
Yes.
Yes, but as you said, presidential assassination attempts, the infiltration of commandos into South Korea as late as, if I remember correctly, the mid-90s was the last commando incursion. I may have the years on that slightly incorrect, but sending commandos into South Korea for any number of reasons, which have included attempted presidential assassination attempts. And those incursions are sent in via these sort of miniature submarines that can get really close to shore or be abandoned in some cases, and deploying literal special forces into South Korea. And now that's evolved into these network attacks that they do. It's the same organization within the North Korean government doing this. While there certainly have been asymmetric engagements that have been conventional military, like when we've seen Northern Limit Line disputes or when we've seen shots fired across the DMZ, that's conventional military. That's the Korean People's Army, Korean People's Army Navy. It's the normal sort of groups we'd be expecting to see. But a lot of this comes from these intelligence organizations or these specially built organs for clandestine operations. That's where we find the assets, all of the sort of network penetration assets are in these organs, especially the Reconnaissance General Bureau. This is the big one. This is sort of the equivalent of the DNI in the United States. It's where all... it's sort of where all the major intelligence organs, we sort of have the nickname for them would be like terrorism organs as well, but that would be sort of a non-academic way to assess this. These groups that are designed to perpetrate certain acts on behalf of the North Korean government that perhaps are in gross contravention of international law, or certainly within contravention of international norms.
And that's a good place to, I suppose, continue the slow walk up here. So the idea behind this new cyber capability, before we get into the finer details of what it is and exactly what is going on there, just a finer detail, a finer talk about just what they're trying to do. And I see you've written here as well, at least once here, that the idea is, at least in some part, to undermine the adversary's will by disruption, destruction, exhaustion, and coercion. And this is not just the will, of course, of South Korea, but this is the will of America to commit themselves to the peninsula.
Right. So this goes into sort of these long-term, very, very long-term strategies. This is not, we sometimes get a little pushback on this. This is not to say, that the goal of the Sony hack is within 2 months to have the United States abandon the Korean peninsula. Like that obviously is a very quick response and not what we're talking about. But we mean the long-term decoupling of South Korea and the United States. There's always concern that a lack of commitment to the peninsula or some sort of disruption in the relationship between the two will lead to this disentangling of the U.S. and South Korea. It's become obviously a very serious political worry throughout 2017 and 2018 for a number of unrelated reasons. But one of the ideas is that, yes, you can introduce essentially friction into a relationship by increasing the costs or by exerting sort of hardship on your adversaries day in and day out, sort of creating a friction that makes people eventually say, well, wouldn't it just be easier if we just sort of didn't have this enemy group here? Wouldn't it be easier if we just either made peace or, found some sort of solution? So it's not necessarily always going with this very clear image in mind. Sometimes it's just about increasing the cost to your adversary, be that in terms of actual money or sort of cultural capital or the happiness of the citizenry. So it's a little complex long-term goal.
So that's a nice little scene-setting situation there. So we now have this idea of what North Korea, at least in terms of conventional military, have been going for. So just for people listening, and this is a challenge for many people who are not initiated in it, what exactly is a cyber attack of the sort that we're going to be speaking about today? Not in the details of exactly what the strategic outcome is, but what exactly are we talking about when we talk about cyber attacks, cyber warfare? Just give us a very brief picture before we move into some of the finer details here.
Absolutely. As you said, this is a fairly opaque and very technical sort of field. I'm a non-technical analyst in the sense that I'm not a computer scientist, but I do the strategic and operational analysis end. So when we're talking about cyber operations, there's a whole host of technical terms we could use instead of these, such as network exploitation, network penetration, that sort of obfuscate it for non-technical sort of readers and listeners. So I'm going to avoid those, and I'm sure if we have computer science folks listening, they're going to pull their hair out for this, so I apologize to y'all. But in this case, we're talking about essentially a group of dedicated military or intelligence personnel who write essentially viruses, malware, worms, who penetrate adversarial networks, so they get access to other people's internal computer networks at their companies, at military organizations, just anywhere where they're not supposed to be. They sit in those networks, they surveil those networks and learn how they work, what's going on inside, and then they sort of execute whatever the plan is. This takes a lot of different forms, as we can talk about later.
Sure.
They have a plurality. They have just a great diversity of missions now, but this involves anything from exfiltration of data. That's a very common one, is just stealing information, whether that's, we've seen allegations that the OPCON plans, stealing basically defense data from South Korean defense firms, as well as seriously concerning operational plans that have allegedly been leaked or removed or exfiltrated from U.S. Forces Korea. This has included banking information, social security numbers of U.S. citizens, just sort of you name it, and it's got a market somewhere and is worth stealing. Sometimes it's more clearly military. Of course, defense goods and defense articles being exfiltrated has certain military concerns, but the theft of tens of thousands of American social security numbers are very concerning. And that could also be banking numbers. Like, we'll talk a little bit about this later, but people sit inside a network for a couple weeks, couple months, couple years, learn how a bank works, and essentially just start stealing from it. They literally running very quiet bank heists. And so basically, a cyber attack is just a fancy way of saying these guys are hackers, they get into networks, and they steal stuff. And on the way out, they sometimes break things. We see a lot of cases where they'll deploy what are called NBR wipers, which just means that they're basically going to destroy someone's hard drive on the way out and cause tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage to networks sometimes.
All right, so from that, I think a lot of the listeners would at least be in some way familiar with the attacks on Sony and the WannaCry attacks and some of these broader ones. So we'll come to them, but just first, let's touch on one aspect that you mentioned just there of this military capability, which is the conventional warfighting capability. Now, of course, we haven't seen, at least from North Korea, cyber warfare as part of a conventional military attack, in the sense that they haven't actually launched a full-scale military attack or something quite significant used in any way in any time recently, so they haven't used cyber capabilities. But in some hypothetical invasion or in some hypothetical war, and of course this has to be a very quick war, as you mentioned earlier, in something like this, what place would the role of cyber warfare take?
So this is a really important question, because it also sort of speaks to more generally what we're seeing globally, because we're still trying to figure that out. There are some that seem like sort of obvious, like, well, you just try and shut down as much of the adversary's networks or feed it bad information as possible. We've seen in Ukraine and various conflicts within Georgia that one sort of option is essentially harassing an adversary's civilian critical infrastructure. So, for example, Ukraine, we've seen the power grid, the national level power grid, be disrupted a few times by mysterious cyber actors. And I can't remember the exact number, a large percentage of Georgian national level computer systems going down prior to contact and engagements during various Russia-Georgia conflicts. So the sort of thing we've started seeing in lower level conflicts is just the disruption of critical networks, critical information systems, and communications and sort of rear area support. So as much as you can disrupt, go ahead and disrupt it. If you can pull out power grids, anything that the adversary uses to be efficient, be functional, talk to itself. This would be very comparable to anyone who's familiar with sort of electronic warfare. So jamming, it sort of looks like information jamming. It sort of looks like breaking opponents' codes and feeding them bad information. And in some cases, it's literally just destroying computers by wiping their hard drive's ability to recognize itself. So it's a little esoteric in that it's a whole sort of, there's a reason the U.S. refers to it as a whole sort of domain. There's a lot that can go on in it, but it's all sort of reaching out and disrupting information.
And I'm assuming an awful lot of those disruptions are simply to throw the enemy off guard in as far as you can then launch a much quicker, much more unprepared for, much more, I suppose, a sort of modern form of blitzkrieg war where the enemy can't.
Exactly.
And I suppose in this situation where America wouldn't be able to recommit forces to the peninsula quick enough.
Exactly. So that would be sort of in the event that the Lightning War, the modern blitzkrieg, would ever occur on the Korean Peninsula. That's exactly what we'd expect to see. We would expect to see attacks against South Korean electrical grids. We would expect to see logistics failing, brigades going the wrong direction, that sort of thing. And in addition to, of course, kinetic war that would be happening at the same time. So it's not like you sort of have this low pressure situation of, our military networks are down, we'll get IT on that. It would be concurrent with, missiles and artillery. So there's just a whole host of complex issues happening at once.
Sure. So just on that, so let's move on to the next side of this for a second. North Korea, and people are quite, I assume that they're quite aware of this. North Korea have got a long history of military provocation. And, of course, this new cyber capability, short of full-out war, as we were just mentioning there, it must now have a significant role to play simply in this realm of continued military provocations.
Yes. So one important thing to separate out is there's sort of a systemic difference between, or we think there's a systemic difference, and this is sort of ongoing research that's not fully fleshed out. But we talk about a little bit in my 2015 report with CSIS, which is that there's sort of an intelligence side, more comparable to sort of CIA and NSA activities, and a more explicitly military side. And those are very weird to disentangle. But so it may not be the case that, for example, the guys prepping for Lightning War are the same folks as the ones stealing from banks right now, although certainly if a war ever happened, they wouldn't be stealing from banks. Those people would be reassigned. So it ends up being a little complicated to actually address where they fit in with sort of the modern warfare people right now.
So from that, let's take a little step forward. And you mentioned them just before, so this is a good moment. Now, we are still going to come to these other aspects of what this war fighting capability comes from. But just to set the scene a touch bit more here, what exactly is the Reconnaissance General Bureau? Because you mentioned earlier, this is where most of these capabilities come from. It's where most of at least, I mean, it's not the only organization, but it's where the bulk of at least some of the modern cyber warfare attacks have been coming from.
That's right. This is where this is where sort of most of the identified actors originate from. The Reconnaissance General Bureau, or the RGB, is sort of this amalgamation of a number of older DPRK intelligence organs. It's sort of comparable to the U.S. Director of National Intelligence role, where it's this organization, like the head of the RGB would be similar to the DNI in the United States. It's someone who sits on top of this organization that has a lot of different intelligence operations that aren't just espionage. It's people who can go out into the field. So it also may be sort of just comparable to the CIA in that sense. where you have, maritime infiltration units. We fortunately haven't seen these used, so it's actually sort of an open question as to whether or not these actually exist in any significant numbers. They most likely do, just have been training at home for a while. Hopefully we'll never see use again. But they've got their maritime infiltration units. They have commando units. These are the organizations that manage a large amount of smuggling. The United Nations Special Designated Entity lists include several individuals from the RGB, and I believe the RGB itself, and possibly redundant sanctions on its sort of bureaus and sub-departments, but they specifically call out at least 2 bureau chiefs from the RGB as being directly involved in smuggling operations and generating capital for the regime outside of legal norms, outside of law, sorry. And so this organization that's focused on asymmetric attacks, asymmetric activity, intelligence, collections, exfiltration, infiltration, theft, smuggling, also is where the all of the sort of cyber operators are. So they share similar missions. I mean, it's if you are housed in the same organization, you are to some degree going to follow the same missions. You may have a specialized submission that, within the military, you may have a specialized submission that differs you significantly from your sort of neighboring departments, but these guys all would be answering to the same leadership. This organization's goal is asymmetric attack, harassment, disruption of adversaries, and currency generation. And so this can be plated onto their, essentially all of their cyber attack teams, for lack of a better term. These are, so sorry, I feel like I'm rambling on this because this is a very curious and opaque organization. But the way to think of it is this is this is a large number of sort of the people that be identified by the United Nations as international criminals and people who would be problems to other nations.
Well, let's talk about one of those criminals, one of these people who did have sanctions and who the listener would be quite aware with, at least by some of the recent news reporting. This guy was, of course, at the Pyeongchang Olympics, and he's been involved in a lot of the high-level talks recently. And this is Kim JungCho, who is the director of this organization. And he's got, before he was getting this new lease of life, at least from the new summit talks, he was the person who was blamed primarily for the bombing of the island off the coast of South Korea and the sinking of the Chonan as well. And now he is also in charge of the cyber operations.
That's right. So Kim JungCho, so first off, we're not 100% sure where he is now in terms of the RGB. We know he ran the RGB at least from 2009, which is when the RGB was first formed. It was sort of forged out of a bunch of separate intelligence organizations that prior to 2009 just existed in various places across the government and as such were slightly inefficient. They pulled them all together, and Kim JungCho is at the top of it. We know he was head of the RGB at least through 2016, but he got a promotion and became the head of the United Front Work Department, and we're not 100% sure if that means he still runs the RGB and just sort of has two hats, or if he has sort of moved on from the RGB but still expresses large amounts of influence over it. We know that other sort of old guards like Oguk-yeol have a lot of influence over RGB operations and may have butted heads with Kim JungCho. So we're no longer 100% sure where he is, but that he's still influential. You don't run your nation's premier spy agency for 7 years and then just sort of disappear from it totally with no influence. But so yes, so the man who was in the White House a few months ago delivering a letter to the President of the United States was largely blamed for the Chonan attack, for the Sony attacks, for any number of things that happened between 2009 and 2016, essentially.
And he's under international sanctions, I believe, at this moment.
I believe so. I'd have to review the sanctions list, but if I reviewed it and found Kim JungCho lacking, I would be quite surprised.
Yeah. So from that framework here. So we've got an idea. Let's move into some of the specifics, and this is going to interest people a lot. So it's probably better to explain to people like myself and people like the listener, just to get a bit more scope on what these cyber attacks are by actually talking through some of these cyber attacks. So one of the subgroups of this reconnaissance department that we've just been speaking about is, I believe it is Room 121 or Bureau 121. And right. This is, so talk about this room, of course, but then talk about their role, because, of course, they are the bureau that is famously behind the Sony attack.
Right. So I'd start off by saying there's a lot of bureaus and a lot of rooms, and since we wrote this report, I feel like there's been a little more fuzziness on that, because there's been, what is the other one, big one that's emerged? I believe it was Bureau 180 that has emerged as a large, important organization. And so these are very granular pieces of data that should all be sort of taken as what we definitely believe to be true, but could be revised as reorganizations occur, of course. And then it's just very opaque in general. So this is sort of where it gets the easiest for things to change day to day. But yes, this is the group that we believed, especially in 2015, was sort of the prime group, just really behind all of the cyber campaigns. This would have been who we had attached to the Lazarus group, though I think once again that maybe have switched by now to Room 180. But it's just the subgroup that exists within the RGB that is focused on cyber operations. We believe since then there may have been a move to creating a higher level entity focused on these sort of attacks. That's still very unclear, unfortunately. So it may be the case that this small bureau got a promotion, or it may be the case that it got split after it got too large. But this is something where the data is still very, very poor, honestly.
And this group, they hacked Sony pictures, I believe. I'm going to get the year wrong here, of course, but I think it was 2013 maybe. And so this is the famous attack that most people are aware of when it comes to North Korea. Now we're going to speak about a few others in just a second here. But how did they get into Sony? Or at least how do you think they got into Sony? What did they do, and why did it make such a scene?
Yes, so the Sony Pictures hack. The Sony Pictures hack is just a very odd event, just because it's also it's sort of an atypical use of these attacks. We would have expected this sort of thing on a bank, not on Sony. The sort of background to this that sort of makes it such a weird and popular story is that Sony was planning on releasing the James Franco and Seth Rogen movie, The Interview, which of course is known for being a not exactly favorable view of North Korea or Kim Jong-un. It involves a graphic assassination scene of Kim Jong-un. Spoilers. Graphic assassination scene of Kim Jong-un at the end. And so this was slated to be released in late 2014. And basically, in the run-up to the release, it's actually not 100% clear to me based on sort of field professionals I've spoken to about this. It's not actually clear to me when the North Koreans were expected to have entered their network. I know from other attacks that they are a very patient group. When we've seen these sort of groups move around, they've sat inside systems for very long periods of time. Not like weeks, but like months to watch, if not more in some cases, to watch sort of the day-to-day activities to make sure that they can get what they need done and then get out. But Sony was sort of on a compressed timeline. I believe September 2014 is when the first noted suspicious activity occurred. I may have that off by about a month. This is all on a very small timeline. But by November, it was identified that the Sony networks had been penetrated because one day all the employees came to work and their computers were completely locked down and had this very ridiculous, over-the-top, very like 1990s hacker culture looking background that said the Guardians of Peace had taken control of their computers and there was a big red skeleton. And it was very weird. It almost felt, it felt once again very 1990s American teenager hacking culture to me. But they exfiltrated at least, I believe they ended up releasing 200 gigabytes of data. They claimed to have gotten a lot more than that. But that's just a claim. I have not seen significant evidence that the multiple terabytes of data they claimed to have taken got taken. Could be. That takes a long time, though. But basically, these North Korean operatives got into their networks. They most likely got in via spear phishing, so they probably targeted employees with emails or sort of other online activities that looked legitimate, that when these employees clicked on a link or followed a link to a website, they thought they were engaging in normal online activities, and in reality, on the other end was North Korean malware collecting information, or a North Korean operative basically taking their credentials and preparing to infiltrate Sony networks under the appearance of an employee.
Once that link's been clicked on, just to get people an idea here, is that essentially game over at that point? They have access if they have, of course, if they're using the right malware, or is there a longer process, or is it as simple as simply making that mistake of believing? So that email comes through and it at least looks legitimate. And of course, this is some of the recent hacking that happened to the Democrats during the recent U.S. election. Email comes through, it looks quite legitimate. You click on the link, and you've basically given up all access to your data to some foreign hacker.
At least a good bit of it. It's not quite game over, but if you sort of have that moment of realization that you've done something wrong, like as an employee, especially as an employee of a company, or especially employee of a government, pull the plug on your computer and call IT immediately. You are on a timeline. And these are phishing emails where, I don't mean to make it sound like these employees are in any way at fault. These are very good quality phishing emails. Field experts that we've talked to have said that sort of early phishing attempts were not particularly they weren't particularly advanced. They were fairly sort of silly emails that a native speaker of English would probably recognize as spam, but that era is over. So for those, you just send them out to a lot of people and hope someone does it by accident. And now it's much more on the spear phishing end. These are high quality emails targeted towards specific individuals or specific groups of individuals with the goal of tricking them, not just playing the odds. So they've gotten very good at what they do. But in 2014, so they basically steal someone's credentials or steal an access point, essentially, find their way into the network, begin to surveil the network, and then just start stealing data, including, if I remember correctly, copies of the movie, a large number of social security numbers for American citizens, which is highly concerning for a number of reasons due to identity theft concerns, and of course private emails, which they began to release as sort of a form of either coercion or just political embarrassment for Sony. Now, those emails that you just mentioned there, they released them through WikiLeaks. Now, this is important because by dumping them onto WikiLeaks and WikiLeaks to send them out there, they also denied responsibility. And this, I suppose, is a question we must come to in terms of what you mentioned earlier about asymmetric capabilities. Not only did they want to hack and use this asymmetric capability that they have, but they wanted to ensure that, or at least do their best to make sure that any attempt at a response didn't come their way by at least keeping arm's length between them and the release of the documents. That's right. They sort of tried to launder documents through a third party, essentially, by putting them up on WikiLeaks. And they repeatedly denied the North Korean government repeatedly denied it had any, involvement in this, because it probably should. This is an not quite unprecedented historically, but this is certainly a very unusual escalation against the United States. The hacking group itself did not take credit and used, I believe, if I remember correctly, 3 different aliases. Guardians of Peace is the one sort of I'm most familiar with and was our sort of call sign for them because that's one of the first ones they used. But then sort of 2 groups took credit for it. Both of these groups are actually probably the same, and both of these groups are probably just Lazarus Group, which is the larger industry name for a very large-scale North Korean campaign that's been going on for 9 years now. And so they worked to obfuscate things. But other analysts have done KCNA analysis to see how often the North Korean government started posting about Sony. North Korea sort of has a trend of responding to Sony allegations very defensively. But more importantly, the U.S. government and a large number of private sector firms, especially if I remember correctly, Mandiant, pulled signatures from the attack. So when you launch a cyber attack, you're using virus, malware, Trojans, any of these things that sort of we've been warned since the 90s not to download and click on. But if they're left around in your system, when they're attacking a computer, you can isolate that. Security professionals know what they're doing. They've every day is basically an open war on the internet, and so you have a lot of battle-hardened professionals who know how to isolate this type of thing and analyze it. When you allow your malware to be analyzed, you can't get your fingerprints off it necessarily. So there's always this deeper attribution problem. In the sense that someone can steal someone else's code. Someone can, once a malware has made its way online, you can acquire it and deploy it and look like someone else. But so much of this attack shared DNA and sort of fingerprints, both at a technical and sort of execution level. So both in the sense that the actual code used, the actual pieces of individual like malware used, from a technical level, and then the way it was employed, so at the human level, matched pre-existing signatures of other hacking groups, and has since then matched additional hacking groups. Has matched previous hacking attempts, and since then has matched additional hacking campaigns, and allows technical experts to very reasonably identify these as the same actors. And then they route some of their data through very specific North Korean computers, which allow them to be linked more cleanly to North Korean state actors. And I know when Sony first occurred, the Sony hack first occurred, there was a good bit of doubt whether or not it was the North Koreans, whether or not it was sort of a coincidence. And every specialist, technical or otherwise, government or private sector I've talked to since then has been very, very, very firm that the ambiguity is very much gone.
So on that, now you are a strategic analyst, so I'm going to get you to think this through for a second here, live on air. So just what do you think about this attack? Because at least it appears from the outside, this Sony attack, and this will be the last question on Sony, but it appears from the outside like it worked. So this is a strategic attack where they use this, so they use cyber warfare, and of course there's also some actual threats to cinemas who are going to play this movie.
Ah, that's right.
And the combination between them actually forced the makers of the movie to, or at least the film company, to pull it from mainstream production. So it seems to have worked. So it seems to, at least from the outside, to be this combination between physical threat and cyber disruption. It seems to have been quite effective.
That's right. There seems to at least have been to some degree a successful coercive attempt against a U.S. company, which is very concerning because in 2017, we did actually see a coercive attempt against a Middle Eastern company that is almost certainly a Roscom. We saw this coercion happen at least one more time from a different threat actor. It's actually, for once, a different North Korean group that's not Lazarus. So yes, it's very concerning. It's a little still confusing to me what the exact goal was. So since then, it's been clear that the North Koreans seem to do sort of multiple layers of goals during their operations. There's a very public-facing part of it, like in the 2009 to 2012 or 13 operations against various banks in South Korea, the sort of Dark Soul campaigns, also called the Troy campaigns or Operation Troy. We saw a lot of exfiltration of data that I believe there's an excellent McAfee analysis that indicates that sort of the destruction of the computers, the sort of breaking things on the way out, was the very public, the initial very public sort of goal. But that there was an underlying theft occurring that may have been the actual deeper goal going on. I don't remember if that's their conclusion or just part of their analysis. It's been a little bit, unfortunately. So I apologize to McAfee people if they feel I'm mischaracterizing it. But so at least on the surface, it appeared that the goal was to embarrass Sony, to disrupt their release of this movie. I mean, obviously, it still got a bizarrely disproportionate amount of press because it was a movie that got attacked by a foreign nation state, which is just a fairly unique status for a movie. So I'm not sure it succeeded in preventing people from seeing it, although I believe, based on the stats later, it was fairly successful at preventing it from making too much money. So I guess it did. But there was also a large amount of data stolen on the back end that could have been somehow related to a deeper plan, either related to identity theft or some sort of other fraudulent activity. But it seemed at least to some degree fairly successful.
And I suppose we'll only really know how successful it was if there is ever another such movie that comes out, because it's really an intimidation kind of process. So if that first one there is about intimidation, let's move on to the one you just mentioned there, the Dark Soul attack, because different to that Sony one, where you're trying to intimidate someone into silence and you're trying to change behavior. That seemed to be this 2012-2013 attack on financial institutions in South Korea. That seemed to be a purely disruptive thing. Now, you mentioned there that there may have been some theft behind the whole thing, but this people may not have been aware of it. I was in Seoul at the time, and it caused absolute havoc. People's bank accounts were down; they couldn't access their own funds, and the whole country was in a sort of panic. And that's not overstating things.
Yeah, it was a fairly high-profile event in South Korea when it occurred, and it's very concerning. It was a 4-year concerted campaign against South Korean banks that really affected the public-facing side, which is sort of the not the impressive bit, but sort of the very notable bit. Is it really hurt people's faith in financial institutions and made it clear that whoever was behind it was capable of, I keep using this phrase, but like reaching out and touching their adversary. But as you said, it's the North Koreans infiltrated a number of South Korean banks. We specifically keep going back to Nonghyup in our analyses because poor little Nonghyup Bank seems to be, for whatever reason, like almost a training bank for North Koreans. They seem to just beat the heck out of it sometime, and I don't know why.
And for people listening, that's a small rural kind of bank. It's very hard to see around South Korea.
Yeah, and we've seen later that they do target sort of smaller banks that may not have the resources to manage a nation state level attack. So they may be sort of punching down. But yeah, the Dark Soul campaign was very concerning because it showed the ability to launch a long-term persistent campaign against a financial institution, degrade public faith in that institution, cause all sorts of havoc with the financial ledgers, and physically destroy hardware. A large amount of hardware was actually destroyed in that because they deployed, if I remember correctly, NBR wipers, which for non-technical listeners, all it means is basically they messed the hard drive up in a way that's very difficult and very expensive to fix if you do it to a large-scale network. And so at the time that we wrote our 2015 report, we were looking at these as sort of the first wave of campaigns. And since then, I've been curious if the proper analytic framework for this campaign is more of practice runs. Because we've seen such larger scale, more sophisticated versions of that later, that I'm curious if this was just sort of the training runs to get the RGB folks sort of in fighting shape for their later attacks. Because they've gotten much more sophisticated, they've gotten much more efficient at stealing things, and they've gotten very brazen recently.
Now that's a very interesting thought you mentioned there, because I suppose that I'm non-technical, I really have no idea, I wouldn't know how to hack someone to start with, but it must be a process, just like a scientific process of trial and error. You try and hack here, you try and hack it, and I suppose over time and over a lot of mistakes and occasional successes, you build up a database or an understanding of how to attack people, but you have to continually do it, because if you stop, then you lose. I suppose there's a technological arms race out there, and you'll lose ground.
That's exactly correct. So as you said, it's like with any skill. If you stop playing piano for a number of years, you're going to forget to some degree how to play. They have a certain set of tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, that they train for, and you need to build them up. So for another sort of military example, so I'm a military analyst, so sort of from the military perspective, this is like when you build out your units initially. If you're building out a squadron, if you're building out a brigade, when you have no one to go from no one doing an activity to a well-trained group of people coordinating under leadership to achieve a common goal requires fairly complex human training. That requires practice. That requires, first off, a base level of education that they can do the thing you need to do. And this is a fairly, this is a fairly technical field. So you need access to the correct kinds of hardware, the correct kinds of software, the correct kinds of education. You need network training. And then, you start going out, you reach out, you find smaller targets that may not have the ability to sort of fight back well. You certainly are looking for targets that can't report your activity well. That's very important. You don't want to burn your ability to act too early. There's an entire sort of strategic art amongst the various sort of network penetration folks about how one balances executing attack versus holding back exploits, because you don't want to use them early. They can be very expensive to acquire if you purchase them from a broker, and you don't want to burn what is literally a multi-billion-dollar exploit just to practice on a small bank. And so 2009 to 2013 seems a whole lot like a small group of people, or not a small group, but a decent-sized group of people training up and learning how to do this, figuring out their tactics, figuring out how to actually do campaigns. And the phrase we use for this sort of campaign is an APT, an advanced persistent threat. It refers to sort of a long-term campaign of network exploitation and network penetration, what we just call a cyber campaign, which sounds a little silly to me, but it's a cyber campaign launched against computers for a long period of time. And in this case, this is a 9-year APT at this point. So it's changed over time, but sort of some of the core technical bits have stayed the same. Like I mentioned earlier, there's sort of a technical side you can ID, and then a human side you can ID. These tactics, techniques, and procedures, plus the actual technical side of the malware. There's stuff we saw in 2009, 2010, 2011 that's still being used in 2018. Sometimes on the technical side, it has to be reconfigured because obviously once a certain form of malware is out, people start building to react to it. But you still see sort of the same human behavior in terms of surveilling, espionage, and that sort of thing.
So if that was the practice run, I assume, at least in part, that some of the later targets that we've seen has been this attack on the UK NHS, which is their health service, and maybe even this very interesting attack in 2007 on Orascom, which is a telecommunications company that actually works inside North Korea, setting up internet and cell phones, but they were having a dispute with the government at the time. Were both those the same type of disruptive attacks, or were they something else?
So the WannaCry attacks are a little more consistent with sort of the Dark Soul Sony side. Orascom is something weird. Orascom is a special box, and we'll talk about that in a second. So let's stick to the NHS. Yeah, let's do WannaCry first because it's a little more straightforward. Although WannaCry is weird too.
Okay, let's do it. Yep.
I'm very curious. I still have an honest analytic question, which is I don't know that WannaCry was supposed to be as big as it was, because it was
200,000 computer systems, I believe.
Yes, it's over 200,000. I don't know what the exact final tally was, but it's well over 200,000 computer systems globally were essentially locked out because they used a BitLocker style malware. And so this is, some listeners may have unfortunately had experience with this. This is a really nasty form of malware where basically once it hits your computer, it encrypts your hard drive forcibly. So, if anyone uses software that encrypts their entire computer, I believe Windows 10 Enterprise has this where you can encrypt your entire computer and you have a special password that decrypts the entire hard drive every time you log on. It's very secure. It's very good. But if someone forcibly does that to your computer and only they have the password, or they're just malicious jerks and they throw the password away so it doesn't matter what you do, you're in a whole mess of trouble. And if that happens to a large number of computers in your company, obviously your company stops for the day. And if that happens in your National Health Service, you have a very serious issue. And so the British National Health Service just got hammered by this. And it's a very confusing set of attacks because hitting a health service is first off weird. That's an odd choice. Like, hospitals are a prime choice for cyber attacks due to having large amounts of personnel data on hand. There's a large amount of personal data on hand. So they're very good targets if you're looking for identity theft, if you're looking to stalk someone, that sort of thing. These are not recommendations. No one go out and hurt a hospital. But, yes. There's a lot of valuable things at a hospital that people would want. But shutting down hospitals is typically not what you want unless you're trying to send the message that, during a conflict, your hospitals aren't safe. But I think that's quite the reach, to say the least. But and it was going to be larger, but fortunately, an analyst essentially found out that there was a kill switch hard-coded into the malware and just sort of messed with the server it was supposed to call back to and shut the whole thing down. It was, hero of the Republic very early for stopping another 400,000 computers from getting shut down. But essentially, so this was traced back to the North Koreans because it shared a number of sort of back-end signatures. I'm not going to get into the technical side of it because it's probably not worth it, but basically there's some back-end code. There are some certain command and control servers it used that basically were common with Lazarus Group, which is, once again, the North Korean group, attacks elsewhere, making it highly probable it was the North Korean government.
And so from that attack, that huge attack that maybe wasn't planned as to be quite that big, let's move into that other strange one that we talked about. Now, Erascom is a very, very strange case study indeed.
Erascom, so there's very little information about this, for one. So if Erascom was not named, but it's very clear that it is the group in question. So there was a report by, I believe it was FireEye, called APT, I think it's APT 37 Reaper, which is a different campaign than Lazarus Group. So the thing we've been talking about this whole time with Dark Soul, with Sony, all that's something that the Department of Homeland Security in the United States calls Hidden Cobra, that private industry calls Lazarus Group, and that we in our report would call just the Reconnaissance General Bureau. There's this second one called Reaper, and we're not sure where it fits in the government. It's probably just still the Reconnaissance General Bureau, but we're actually not sure. And it is a primarily espionage and data gathering oriented APT. So typically this is not an APT that is going into computers and messing them up. This one's not launching encryption attacks, forcible encryption attacks against businesses. Which we should also note that the whole thing with WannaCry was that there was a ransom you could pay. There was a money-making element to it, though from everything I've heard, they made almost a very small amount of money, if any, off of it.
And essentially that involved, if you pay them the money, they'll unlock your computer for you, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So also you have to trust that they're going to do that.
Yes.
That's very generous of them. So this Reaper, Reaper's got a very scary name. It's not as scary. Lazarus Group is the big baddies basically for this. But Reaper is an espionage-oriented thing. It gathers a lot of information. It hits a large number of industrial and military targets in South Korea, which is highly concerning for a number of reasons. But they steal data. They steal intellectual property rights. They steal industrial data. They infiltrate, if I remember correctly, industrial control systems and to take a look inside, which is very concerning from a destructive standpoint, because if they decide to essentially go feral, they can start wreaking a lot of havoc. But for now, they just sort of take data. Except for once. There was one instance that, once again, I believe it was FireEye found, that in 2017, Reaper launched a concerted series of harassing attacks, and the details of these attacks I don't believe were released. Or if they have, this data has evaded me. But they launched a series of harassing attacks and a campaign of, once again, I don't know what kind of attacks, unfortunately, but some sort of attacks against an unnamed Middle Eastern company that engages in a telecoms joint venture with North Korea. Now, there's exactly one company, as far as I'm aware, that does that. That's yes. Erascom, the Egyptian company. And this was during 2017 when Erascom was having its weird profit issues with North Korea, or at least when those profit issues were coming to a head, because those had existed. Those were an underlying problem for years. And we're still trying to figure out what to make of it. It appears that North Korea utilized one of its sort of operational teams to politically or to economically harass and or coerce a potential economic sort of negotiator or partner. So we kind of see echoes of Sony in that, in the sense of we're trying to get our way, so we're going to harass you and do a bunch of nasty stuff to you. But you didn't see this release of data in the same way. My guess is there was a large exfiltration of data, and perhaps maybe, I don't know, so I'm not going to speculate on the other things, but we're not sure what happened, except that Roscom was harassed in some way different than the other sort of victims of this APT. It wasn't just exfiltration, it sounds like.
And I'm assuming that different level of harassment involved the fact that Roscom is still operating inside North Korea, and North Koreans were hoping that they would eventually, I suppose, win the dispute, and Roscom would continue to operate on the terms that North Korea would hope for, I guess.
I guess that, so that's the best I can figure as well, but it's a fairly abusive relationship, and
yes.
I'm sort of surprised that a telecom would just go, yes, this non-profitable relationship that has been a lot of trouble for us repeatedly is much better now that you are stealing my data and harassing my employees.
Yes.
But, that's, again, I shouldn't speculate as to what exactly happened, except that it was reported that basically that some sort of engagement occurred between this known hacking entity and the unnamed but definitely a Roscom joint venture.
All right, so we've spoken there about these disruptive attacks, this intimidation, conventional warfare attacks, and throughout a lot of these attacks has been, as you've mentioned a few times, this premise that maybe money was stolen or maybe money was sought in some of these organizations. But there is a very important modern take on this, and there's of course a recent attack in Bangladesh, which was a straight-out bank heist.
Yes.
And of course, some of the recent attacks have been simply to make money, nothing else, no coercion, no intimidation. I suppose that's always implied a little bit, but these are just money-making enterprises as well.
Yes, and this is where it's very interesting. Not to keep referencing this, so we wrote this report in 2015 discussing sort of the RGB's participation in these attacks, and it definitely seemed like it was primarily a coercive and sort of data theft a little bit, but it seemed like it was on track to be a coercive entity. And it appears that by 2018 it has turned into a just serial bank heist machine. And that is very concerning and strange, that there is essentially a state-sponsored regular bank heist entity. And so for listeners unfamiliar with the Bangladeshi case, there's a number of just wild stories about it online. And I feel like that's probably unprofessional as an analyst to say, I promise I'm a professional analyst. This is a weird story. Where essentially these teams that were identified to most likely be very much most likely to be North Korean teams. This is another instance where sort of I've talked to field experts. I don't have sort of government opinions on this one, but I have gotten a number of private sector opinions, and all the private sector analysts agree that this has all the fingerprints of a North Korean attack for a number of reasons. Basically, they staked out and fished a Bangladeshi bank. They got inside the network, so completely consistent with sort of a regular campaign, not the biggest deal in the world, and they sat in the network. And I don't know exactly how long they sat in the network for, but they waited and they watched everything. And they learned how employees did business. They learned sort of how transactions to the SWIFT network were sent. And this is like a fairly large deal because SWIFT is meant to be a very secure means of banks talking to each other. SWIFT is the sort of underpinning of international monetary exchange, at least from bank to bank transactions. So penetrating SWIFT is a fairly big deal. That doesn't typically happen. SWIFT is billed as a ironclad, perfectly safe system. SWIFT still says it's a perfectly safe system and that essentially the endpoints are unsafe, which is true. So they got into this network. They watched how people interacted with SWIFT. They watched how people submitted and received requests. They watched how they printed them out in the office. And they basically just figured out, what does a regular day in this office look like? And that's a very powerful piece of information to have for a bank. And so after surveilling for a while, they essentially activated the plan. I feel like there's no way to not talk about this where it sounds like an exciting bank heist because it's such a bizarre thing. They basically undertook almost $1 billion worth of fraudulent transactions, sent these requests. I believe they sent it on like I may have the timeline off by like a couple hours on like a Thursday night on American time. That was the start or midsection of Chinese New Year in East Asia. So they lined up specifically 2 times when they knew that the Fed in New York would not be paying attention because people were about to go home for the weekend and people were home for the holidays in East Asia. And that's fairly clever. And they submit all these fraudulent claims or fraudulent transfers and then essentially erase all the data as much data as they could find in the Bangladeshi bank, indicating that they requested them. So they deleted things off the printer so that when the employees came in the morning or came in after Chinese New Year, there would be no printouts that indicated there was $1 billion in excess things. And they were essentially trying to pull money out of banks, send it to this Bangladeshi bank, transfer it to banks in Philippines and I believe Sri Lanka, and then withdraw it and then just disappear. Due to a series of poor choices in fraudulent company names, most of the money got stopped, fortunately. I believe $81 million is what actually got sent to the Philippines, and a fraction of that, I believe, actually got withdrawn. But that's a fairly large bank heist. $81 million is not an insignificant amount of money to get pretty far down the line. The hardest parts of that they did. And this
of course, all that is very important for a country that's under heavy sanctions at the moment.
Exactly. And so this has emerged as a potential vector for sanctions evasion. So once again, as we discussed earlier, the RGB is related heavily to smuggling and sanctions evasion. They have ships, they have front companies, they do a lot of very conventional smuggling. And now they seem to be getting into non-conventional, very creative smuggling and currency raising, because this is not the only bank heist they're associated with. The details of the other heists are usually the details of other events aren't always public and aren't always accessible, but there's been a series of basically other things sort of happening. There's been known targets, I believe, in Poland and Eastern Europe, if I remember correctly, where similar things have occurred or similar fingerprints have showed up, and it's thought that basically the RGB is taking a close eye, is keeping a close eye on banks that do not have the central infrastructure necessary to handle this kind of network penetration and don't have the oversight required to prevent unauthorized access into the international SWIFT system, which is concerning.
So that's a fascinating look into the reach of North Korea's cyber capabilities there. So as a final question, I may get you to look into the future here and just give us some speculation on how you think that this is going to play out. Is this going to remain a central part of North Korea's warfighting capabilities? Is it going to morph into something else? Are they going to branch out and attack more individual people like academics writing books? Or how do you see the future of this capability inside North Korea? And of course, as a last question, how do you see the response? Because you said that it was this is of course a asymmetric capability. So yes. How do you see the responses? Are we going to, as America and South Korea and these nations, going to hack in response, or is something else going to happen, or is nothing possible?
Oh, so there's a lot there.
Yes, I suppose so.
So starting, I'd say it's going to stay. It's definitely going to remain a warfighting capability. There's been no reason to discard it so far, but fortunately, we probably will never see that. We will hopefully never see that executed. Hopefully, that will never have to be a data point we have to analyze. But this will stay as a warfighting capability. More importantly, for the day-to-day, it seems that this bank heist thing seems to be the trend right now. There's a series of other malwares that have been deployed. The Department of Homeland Security has issued warnings that since the Singapore summit even, they have been active. Lazarus Group has been continuing to conduct operations and deploy malware, so it's not something that has disappeared even in this new era of good feelings. And so this is going to keep going. the shift from harassment and sort of exfiltration to bank heists was certainly not something that I necessarily predicted. So I'm not sure I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to predict whether or not they're just going to keep up with bank heists or switch to something else. It would not surprise me based on both the exfiltration of data and money and the sort of growing expertise of the other APT reported, APT 37 Reaper, that they may start moving on to stealing more industrial IP in a similar vein to what we saw coming out of the People's Republic of China in the 1990s and 2000s, where you get a large amount of industrial theft as an attempt to shore up businesses, particularly if North Korea attempts to rejoin international markets. If we do get a peace treaty, if we do get sanctions released over the next 5 years, if we do get sort of the era of good feelings turned into process, suddenly North Korea is going to have to be competitive on the market. And if they can get a little state assistance being competitive, the North Korean state has rarely had issues helping its industries out. So we may see that. We may see something we're a little more familiar with because we've been dealing with it for years. Most of this isn't world-ending, though. I feel like whenever I give talks on this, it's kind of this disappointing ending where it's like, this is all very flashy stuff. Like the Sony hack is very flashy, very high scale. Harassing a Roscom is a huge deal. Stealing millions and millions of dollars is that's a concerning for a number of reasons. It doesn't change much except complicates the relationship with the DPRK. If they would stop, that would certainly improve the international community's relationship with them, particularly since they've essentially declared war on the SWIFT system. They're undermining international banking in a very frustrating way. But perhaps the solution to that ends up being get the North Koreans to join the international banking system, which has, I am aware of sanctions and understand that is one of the more complicated suggestions I could make is rejoin the International Monetary Order and trade. But the North Koreans currently don't have a stake in keeping the monetary order stable. They don't have a stake in protecting SWIFT. They don't have a stake in protecting other people's intellectual property rights. It's early over here.
Yes.
And they certainly don't have a stake in helping other regional actors protect themselves from cyber attacks. Sort of one thing we've discussed, and I wouldn't speak for my co-authors on this because this is something I've talked about with others and haven't conferred with them. But like regional CERTs, of course, computer emergency readiness or sometimes response teams. It's called a CERT. There's a lot of them. Most countries have at least one, and then there's sort of regional ones. These are basically like firefighters for computers. They're supposed to help when international sort of threats emerge or when large-scale threats emerge within a country. These folks are supposed to swing in and start helping with the situation. They do a lot of information management and exchanging sort of threat signatures to make sure that other people are ready for this, or are ready for emerging threats. But North Korea has relatively low internet penetration. They have relatively low industrial and commercial use of the internet. It's not a commercial asset in the same way that it is the commercial asset in South Korea, for example. And they currently don't benefit from CERTs. They benefit from undermining CERTs. And so if there was a way to flip that, if there was sort of an inter-Korean CERT team or some way to some way to encourage them into AP CERT, the Asia-Pacific CERT, that would give them a stake in the system. But I have no idea how you reach that point because they're currently undermining the system. I don't think that's something that comes from the RGB, certainly. I think that's an order that comes down from above. In terms of, you mentioned sort of the hackback scenarios, and honestly, we just get so little information about that. I was surprised during the Sony hack that the National Security Agency, the NSA in the United States, came out with a concurring opinion that it was the North Koreans. The NSA doesn't talk, so it was very surprising to hear them say anything about that. We're going to learn very little about their activities, I imagine. I know just this week, President Trump signed a new order or a modification to one of President Obama's orders that essentially, it's not an executive order, I forget the exact name of the memoranda, but it basically is the guidance on how the U.S. conducts, or specifically does not conduct, offensive cyber operations. And allegedly the president has signed something this week sort of rolling it back and saying that the U.S. should be a bit more aggressive in how it handles network defense and network attack. There have certainly been rumors of U.S. attacks on North Korean infrastructure in the past. There's been rumors of U.S. attacks on other states' infrastructure, but it's it's a lot harder to get good data on that for a number of reasons. So I'm not totally, this is a very rambly way of saying I'm not totally sure what the problem is or what the solution is. But we certainly can highlight a lot of the problems.
Yes, I mean, as with all North Korean issues, it is incredibly hard to think about an easy solution. So yeah, I think you've done a great job there. It's been fascinating, and this is an extremely challenging issue and shadowy issue to talk through, so I really appreciate what you've done here. And of course, as you said, it's extremely early where you are, so thank you for waking up at crack of dawn for this as well.
Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Not a problem.
Very good.
Yeah, Scott LaFoy, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you so much.